Before Venezuela became a symbol of oil wealth, political struggle, or global attention, it was largely an agricultural nation. In the early 1900s, its economy depended on crops like coffee and cocoa, and it played only a minor role on the world stage. That changed in 1914. In that year, a drilling site called Zumac I, located in the eastern region of Venezuela, struck oil. This was not just another discovery, it marked the birth of Venezuela's modern oil era. By the 1920s, foreign oil companies, mostly from the United States and Europe, flooded into the country. They brought capital, technology, and infrastructure, transforming Venezuela at a speed few nations had ever experienced. By 1928, Venezuela had become the world's largest oil exporter, surpassing even the United States. Oil replaced agriculture almost overnight, turning Venezuela into one of the most important energy suppliers on Earth. This rapid transformation reshaped the country's cities, economy, and politics. Ports expanded, roads were built, urban populations exploded, but control over the oil itself remained largely in foreign hands. For global powers, Venezuela's oil was not just about fuel, it was about security, industry, and influence. As industrialization accelerated worldwide, access to reliable oil sources became essential, and Venezuela sat at the center of that demand. From this moment on, Venezuela's fate became tied to a single resource. Oil brought wealth, attention, and power, but it also planted the seeds of long-term dependence. By the end of the 1920s, Venezuela was no longer a quiet agricultural nation. It had become a strategic energy state, deeply connected to the global system, a position it has never left since. This was only the beginning. By the late 1930s, Venezuela's oil was no longer just an economic resource. It had become a strategic asset in a world moving toward total war. When World War II began in 1939, global demand for oil surged. Armies, navies, and air forces all depended on fuel, and the Allied powers needed reliable supplies outside of Europe. Venezuela filled that role. Throughout the 1940s, Venezuelan oil powered Allied ships, aircraft, and vehicles, especially for the United States and Britain. Its geographic location, close to North America and far from active battlefields, made it one of the safest and most dependable sources of fuel during the war. This elevated Venezuela's importance almost overnight. Oil shipments from Venezuelan ports became essential to wartime logistics, tying the country more closely to U.S. strategic interests. After the war ended in 1945, oil did not lose its importance. Instead, it became the foundation of the new global order. As the Cold War emerged in the late 1940s, energy security became a major concern for Western nations. The United States, now a global superpower, sought stable oil supplies to fuel its economy, military bases, and growing influence worldwide. Venezuela, already deeply integrated into U.S. oil networks, became a key partner. By the 1950s, Venezuela was one of the top oil suppliers to the United States. American companies dominated production, refining, and export operations, reinforcing U.S. influence inside the Venezuelan economy. But this relationship was not purely equal. While oil revenues transformed Venezuela's infrastructure and urban life, decisions about production levels and profits were often made abroad. This imbalance planted early frustrations among Venezuelan leaders and citizens, who began questioning foreign dominance over national resources. Still, on the global stage, Venezuela had become indispensable. Oil connected the country to wars, alliances, and diplomatic strategies far beyond its borders. By the mid-20th century, Venezuela was no longer just producing oil. It had become part of the machinery that powered global power itself. And that growing influence would soon push Venezuela, and other oil producers, to seek greater control over their resources. By the late 1950s, oil-producing nations were growing increasingly frustrated. Despite supplying the fuel that powered the global economy, they had little control over oil prices or production decisions. Those decisions were largely made by Western oil companies. In 1960, that imbalance triggered a historic shift. That year, Venezuela joined Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait to form the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC. The goal was simple but revolutionary: oil producers would cooperate to protect their interests and control their resources. For Venezuela, this was a strategic move shaped by decades of experience. Unlike many producers, Venezuela had a long history of dealing with international oil companies and understood the global energy market. This made the country one of OPEC's intellectual architects. Throughout the 1960s, Venezuela played a key role in shaping OPEC's policies, pushing for fairer pricing and national control over oil production. The organization gradually transformed oil from a commodity controlled by corporations into a political and economic weapon wielded by states. That power became unmistakable in the 1970s. During the 1973 oil crisis, OPEC nations restricted oil supply in response to geopolitical tensions. Oil prices skyrocketed, shaking Western economies and proving that oil producers now held real leverage. For Venezuela, the crisis confirmed what leaders had long suspected: control over oil meant control over national destiny. Oil revenues surged, state confidence grew, and the idea of reclaiming full ownership of the oil industry gained massive public support. By the mid-1970s, Venezuela stood at a crossroads. It had oil wealth, international influence, and growing national ambition. The next step was inevitable. In 1976, Venezuela made one of the most important decisions in its history, taking full control of its oil. By the early 1970s, Venezuela stood in a powerful position. Oil prices were high, OPEC had proven its influence, and public support for national control of oil had reached a peak. On January 1, 1976, Venezuela officially nationalized its oil industry. Foreign oil concessions were ended, and the government created a new state-owned company, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A., known as PDVSA. For the first time, Venezuela fully owned and controlled its most valuable resource. The move was widely celebrated. Nationalization was seen as the fulfillment of decades of struggle, a declaration of economic sovereignty. During the late 1970s and 1980s, PDVSA quickly became one of the most respected national oil companies in the world. It operated efficiently, attracted skilled professionals, and expanded refining operations both inside and outside Venezuela. Oil revenues transformed the country. Income from petroleum funded education, healthcare, infrastructure, and social programs. Highways expanded, cities modernized, and Venezuela became one of Latin America's wealthiest nations. But beneath the success, a structural problem remained. Oil accounted for the vast majority of export earnings and government revenue. Other sectors of the economy weakened as the state grew increasingly dependent on oil income. By the 1980s, global oil prices began to fluctuate, exposing the risks of that dependence. When prices fell, government budgets shrank, debt increased, and social tensions grew. The promise of oil wealth was real, but it was also fragile. Nationalization had given Venezuela control, but it had not freed the country from oil's volatility. Instead, it tied the nation's future even more closely to a single resource. By the end of the 1980s, economic pressures were mounting, and public confidence in the political system was eroding. These conditions set the stage for a new political movement, one that would place oil at the center of a radical national transformation. By the late 1990s, Venezuela was in crisis. Falling oil prices, rising debt, and public anger toward traditional political elites had weakened trust in the system. In 1999, that frustration brought Hugo Chávez to power. Chávez promised a political revolution, and oil was at the center of it. He argued that Venezuela's petroleum wealth had been misused for decades and that it should directly benefit the poor. Soon after taking office, Chávez moved to tighten state control over PDVSA, redirecting oil revenues towards social programs known as misiones. During the early 2000s, high global oil prices made this strategy possible. Oil income funded free healthcare, education initiatives, housing projects, and food subsidies. For many Venezuelans, living conditions initially improved. But oil also became a political tool. In 2002, tensions between the government and the oil industry erupted during a national strike, including a shutdown of PDVSA operations. The government responded by firing thousands of experienced oil workers, consolidating political control over the company. This moment marked a turning point. From that point on, PDVSA was no longer run primarily as a professional energy company. It became an extension of the state's political agenda. Investment declined, maintenance suffered, and technical expertise was lost. Despite warning signs, oil prices surged again between 2004 and 2012, masking the damage. Revenues kept flowing, reinforcing dependence on oil rather than encouraging diversification. When Hugo Chávez died in 2013, his successor Nicolás Maduro inherited an economy almost entirely reliant on petroleum exports. Soon after, global oil prices collapsed in 2014. The impact was devastating. With oil accounting for the vast majority of export earnings, government revenue dried up. Hyperinflation, shortages, and mass emigration followed. Oil had once empowered Venezuela's political project. Now, it exposed its limits. What began as a promise to reclaim national wealth had evolved into deep economic vulnerability, all tied to a single resource. By the mid-2010s, Venezuela still possessed enormous oil reserves. But production was falling, infrastructure was decaying, and international pressure was rising. The question was no longer whether Venezuela had oil. It was whether it could still use it. In 2010, Venezuela reached a historic milestone. That year, it officially surpassed Saudi Arabia to become the country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. The total was staggering: over 300 billion barrels of crude oil, much of it located in the Orinoco Belt. On paper, Venezuela was richer in oil than any nation in history. This discovery reshaped how the world viewed Venezuela. Energy analysts, governments, and corporations recognized that Venezuela's oil reserves alone could influence global markets for decades. Even as production declined, the sheer size of those reserves kept Venezuela strategically relevant. But there was a problem. Much of Venezuela's oil is heavy crude, difficult and expensive to extract and refine. Producing it requires advanced technology, skilled labor, and steady investment. By the early 2010s, Venezuela was losing all three. Following the oil price collapse in 2014, investment dried up. Sanctions imposed later in the decade further restricted access to equipment, financing, and international markets. Production fell sharply. By 2020, Venezuela's oil output had dropped to levels not seen since the 1940s. Refineries malfunctioned, pipelines corroded, and power shortages disrupted operations. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. Venezuela possessed the world's greatest oil wealth, yet lacked the capacity to fully extract or sell it. Oil that once fueled global growth now sat underground, untapped. Despite this, Venezuela's oil continued to shape international calculations. Because in a world still dependent on fossil fuels, reserves matter, even if they remain unused. By the early 2020s, Venezuela's oil had become less about production and more about potential. Potential that could reshape markets, alliances, and political outcomes if unlocked. This is why, even in crisis, Venezuela never faded from global attention. Because oil is not just about barrels pumped today, it's about power tomorrow. Even after decades of crisis and mismanagement, Venezuela's oil remains one of the most important resources on Earth. By 2020, production had fallen to historic lows, barely a fraction of what the country once exported. Yet, the world still watched closely. In 2025 and 2026, global events brought Venezuela back into the spotlight. Geopolitical tensions, sanctions, and political maneuvering highlighted the fact that whoever controls Venezuela's oil can influence markets, alliances, and energy security worldwide. Why does this matter? Because oil is not just a commodity, it is power. It shapes diplomacy, military strategy, and the balance of influence between nations. Venezuela's reserves give it leverage, even when pipelines are idle and refineries falter. History shows us that Venezuela has always been more than just a Latin American country. From the 1914 discovery at Zumac I, to supplying World War II, to shaping OPEC policies in the 1960s, and nationalizing oil in 1976, oil has been the thread connecting Venezuela to global history. Today, that thread remains unbroken. While production struggles and political crises dominate headlines, the potential power of Venezuela's oil ensures that the country continues to be a major player on the world stage. In short, Venezuela's oil has never just mattered, it has always mattered to the world. And as long as energy drives global politics, the story of Venezuela's oil is far from over.